We did not leave the pits behind all at once. The sound of them faded first, then the smell, and finally the sense of proximity, until what remained was only the tunnels again, and the steady, patient movement of water beneath the city. That persistence mattered. It meant the place continued to function whether or not anyone watched it. The passage sloped downward as we moved on, not sharply, but enough that the stonework began to change again, growing rougher and less regular, the work of hands giving way to something more accidental. Mortar thinned, joints widened. The walls no longer bore the marks of repeated human contact. Life here had found other uses. The first sign was the texture beneath my boots. The stone grew uneven, softened in places where moisture had been allowed to collect and linger, and as I slowed, testing each step, I noticed the faint crunch that should not have been there, brittle and dry, yielding too easily underfoot. I crouched and brushed a hand along the ground, lifting it slowly, and what clung to my fingers confirmed it. Fragments of chitin, pale and hollow, accumulated over time and ground, down by passage until they became part of the floor itself. The ranger noticed the same thing a breath later. He did not speak, but his posture shifted, weight redistributing as though the ground itself had begun to argue with him. The fighter's grip tightened on nothing in particular, the way it does when the threat ahead has not yet decided how it intends to reveal itself. The mage frowned at the walls, tracing patterns where the stone had been hollowed in shallow arcs and channels, not carved so much as eaten, and I could see the moment he recognized the difference. This was not damage. This was habitation. The air changed again as we continued, growing warmer and more humid, thick with a faint, sour-sweet scent that sat uncomfortably between rot and growth. It reminded me of places where things are allowed to fester because no one considers them important enough to clean. That, I realized, was the pattern repeating itself. We reached a chamber where the tunnel widened abruptly, the ceiling lifting just enough to allow shapes to emerge from shadow, and there, the city's neglect had completed its work. The walls were honeycombed with openings of uneven size, some no larger than a fist, others wide enough to disappear into entirely, their edges smooth and darkened by repeated passage. Pale, translucent residue clung to the stone, catching the low light in dull, uneven patches. Movement came slowly at first, then with greater certainty, not rushing toward us but adjusting, repositioning, as though the space itself were taking note of our presence. Large insects emerged from the openings, not in a swarm, not in attack, but individually, methodically, their bodies adapted to darkness and damp, their limbs clicking softly against stone as they tested the air. They were not hostile. They were curious. That, somehow, was worse. These creatures had not been placed here as guards or weapons. They had not been trained or directed. They existed because the conditions allowed them to exist, feeding on refuse, on waste, on the things that fell through the cracks of a system too focused on efficiency to notice what it left behind. The cleric whispered something then, not a prayer exactly, but an observation, and I caught only part of it, enough to understand that he had reached the same conclusion I had. This place was not an aberration. It was an outcome. The insects shifted again as we moved, responding to vibration and heat, antennae sweeping slowly through the air. Some retreated into their warrens. Others remained, blocking nothing, threatening nothing, simply occupying space that now belonged to them. We did not charge. We did not retreat. We moved carefully, deliberately, choosing each step with attention, and the creatures allowed it, not out of mercy or malice, but because conflict had not yet proven necessary. That balance felt temporary. The warrens extended farther than the chamber itself, branching off into tunnels that intersected with the slavers' roots, creating a living boundary between what was controlled and what was merely tolerated. It was easy to see how prisoners who strayed too far or were discarded carelessly might never return. The system consumed its excess in more ways than one. As we passed through the outer edge of the warrens, I felt the weight of what we had learned settle further into place. Above us were people reduced to inventory. Beside us were creatures thriving on neglect. Ahead of us were those who had decided this arrangement was acceptable. The city had not merely hidden its problem underground. It had fed it. We emerged from the warrens into narrower tunnels once more, and only then did I realize how tense my body had been, how carefully each breath had been measured. The insects did not follow. They had no reason to. They already had everything they needed. We paused briefly, none of us speaking, allowing the silence to reassert itself. And in that quiet, I understood that the path forward was no longer a question of stopping a raid or disrupting a route. It was about breaking a system that had learned how to sustain itself. And systems like that do not collapse on their own. They must be taken apart, deliberately.